February 23, 1964, Daytona International Speedway. 4 Plymouth Belvederes lined up at the starting line, each hiding a secret weapon under the hood that would change NASCAR forever. By the end of that day, these Mopars didn't just win the Daytona 500, they obliterated the competition, finishing 1, 2, 3, 4 and stunning the entire racing world. The engine responsible? The legendary 426 Hemi. But here's the kicker. It was so dominant, so devastatingly powerful, that NASCAR would ban it entirely just 1 year later. This is the story of the engine that was literally too good for its own good. To understand why the 426 Hemi became the most feared engine in NASCAR history, we need to go back to the early 1960s. Chrysler was getting absolutely hammered on the racetrack. Ford had their 427 side-oiler making serious power, and Chevrolet was dominating with their 409 and later the 427 big blocks. Meanwhile, Chrysler were stuck with their 426 Max Wedge engines, which were powerful but just couldn't keep up with the competition. The Max Wedge was no slouch. It was making around 415 to 425 horsepower in its hottest configurations. But in the world of NASCAR, where every horsepower matters and aerodynamics were becoming increasingly important, Chrysler needed something revolutionary. They needed to go back to their roots, back to the hemispherical combustion chamber design that had made them famous in the 1950s. You see, Chrysler had been using Hemi engines since 1951, starting with their 331 cubic inch firepower V8. These early Hemis were engineering marvels. The hemispherical combustion chamber allowed for larger valves, better breathing, and more efficient combustion. But by 1958, Chrysler had moved away from the Hemi design in favor of the cheaper-to-manufacture wedge-head engines. The tooling costs were lower, the engines were easier to service, and they took up less space in the engine bay. But in 1963, with their backs against the wall in NASCAR competition, Chrysler made a bold decision. They would resurrect the Hemi, but this time they'd make it bigger, badder, and more powerful than anything they'd ever built. Enter the 426 Hemi. But not the street version you might be familiar with. This was the race Hemi, a purpose-built, NASCAR-only monster that would rewrite the rules of stock car racing. The development of this engine was shrouded in secrecy. According to insider accounts, the engine blocks were poured into molds in December 1963, just 2 months before the Daytona 500. These weren't production engines, they were hand-built prototypes assembled at Chrysler's engine lab in Highland Park, Michigan. The engineers were working around the clock, knowing they had one shot to prove that Mopar could compete with the best. What made this new Hemi so special? First, the displacement. At 426 cubic inches, it matched the NASCAR limit perfectly. But more importantly, it was the combustion chamber design that set it apart. While Ford and Chevrolet were using wedge-shaped combustion chambers, the Hemi featured a true hemispherical design that allowed for massive valves, 2.25 inches for the intake and 1.94 inches for the exhaust. This meant the engine could breathe like nothing else on the track. The camshaft was another piece of the puzzle. These race Hemis used extremely aggressive cam profiles that would make your typical street engine sound like a tractor. We're talking about cams with massive lift and duration that kept the valves open long enough to really pack the cylinders with air and fuel. Combined with the excellent port flow of the Hemi heads, these engines were making power numbers that seemed almost impossible for the era. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. Chrysler didn't just show up to Daytona with 1 or 2 cars, they came loaded for bear. Richard Petty was driving the number 43 Plymouth, but he wasn't alone. Jimmy Pardue, Paul Goldsmith, and Bobby Isaac were all wheeling Hemi-powered Plymouths, and they had one mission: prove that Mopar was back in a big way. But even Chrysler wasn't prepared for what happened next. In qualifying, the Hemi-powered cars didn't just run fast, they absolutely destroyed the competition. Paul Goldsmith grabbed the pole position with a lap time that left Ford and Chevrolet teams scratching their heads. The writing was on the wall, but nobody knew just how dominant these engines would be in the actual race. Race day arrived, and from the drop of the green flag, it was clear that something special was happening. The Hemi-powered Plymouths weren't just fast, they were in a completely different league. While the Ford and Chevrolet teams were struggling to keep up, the Mopars were pulling away like they had rockets strapped to them. Richard Petty took the lead early and never looked back. But what made this win so devastating for the competition wasn't just that he won, it was how he won. Petty finished a full lap ahead of second-place Jimmy Pardue, who was also driving a Hemi-powered Plymouth. Paul Goldsmith finished third, another lap behind, and Bobby Isaac brought home fourth place. It was a complete and total Mopar sweep of the top four positions. The margin of victory was staggering. In NASCAR, races are typically decided by seconds, sometimes fractions of a second. But Petty won by over 2.5 minutes. To put that in perspective, that's like winning a Formula One race by 30 seconds. It just doesn't happen unless you have a massive technological advantage. But the real story wasn't just the Daytona 500. As the 1964 season progressed, the Hemi-powered cars continued their domination. They weren't just winning races, they were making the competition look amateur. Richard Petty alone won 9 races that season, and other Hemi drivers were picking up wins left and right. The engine was so dominant that it fundamentally changed how teams approached race strategy. You see, with the traditional engines of the era, NASCAR races were often won through pit strategy, smart driving, and a little bit of luck. Cars were relatively evenly matched, so the best drivers and crews usually came out on top. But the Hemi changed all that. Suddenly, having the right engine under the hood was more important than anything else. If you didn't have a Hemi, you weren't competing for the win. You were competing for the best finish among the non-Hemi cars. The power output of these race Hemis was legendary. While Chrysler never officially released dyno numbers, insiders estimated that these engines were producing upwards of 600 horsepower, with some of the more aggressive builds pushing 700 horsepower or more. To put that in perspective, the typical NASCAR engine of the era was making around 450 to 500 horsepower. The Hemi wasn't just more powerful, it was overwhelmingly more powerful. So what made the 426 Hemi so devastatingly effective? It all comes down to the engineering. The hemispherical combustion chamber wasn't just a cool design feature, it was a fundamental advantage that allowed the engine to do things that wedge-head engines simply couldn't match. First, let's talk about valve sizing. In a traditional wedge-head engine, the valves are arranged in a line, typically at an angle to the cylinder bore. This arrangement limits how large the valves can be because they have to fit within the confines of the cylinder head. But with a hemispherical design, the valves are arranged around the circumference of the hemisphere, allowing for much larger valve diameters. The race Hemi used intake valves that were 2.25 inches in diameter, absolutely massive for the era. The exhaust valves were 1.94 inches, which was also larger than what most competitors were running. Larger valves mean better airflow, and better airflow means more power. It's that simple. But it wasn't just the valve size that made the difference. The port design was also critical. The Hemi heads featured ports that were carefully shaped to promote smooth airflow into and out of the combustion chamber. The intake ports were designed to create a slight swirl in the air-fuel mixture, which helped with mixing and combustion efficiency. The exhaust ports were shaped to scavenge spent gases as efficiently as possible. The combustion chamber shape itself was another major advantage. A true hemispherical chamber allows for optimal flame propagation during combustion. When the spark plug fires, the flame front spreads out evenly in all directions, creating a more complete burn of the air-fuel mixture. This means more of the fuel's energy is converted to mechanical work rather than being wasted as heat. The compression ratio of these race Hemis was also optimized for maximum power. While street engines of the era typically ran compression ratios around 9:1 to 10:1, the race Hemis were running compression ratios of 12:1 or higher. Higher compression means more power, but it also requires better fuel and more precise tuning. Fortunately, race fuel was available, and Chrysler's engineers knew how to make it work. The camshaft profiles used in these engines were truly radical. We're talking about cams with lift figures that would make modern performance enthusiasts jealous, combined with duration numbers that kept the valves open for what seemed like forever. These cams were designed for one thing: maximum airflow at high RPM. They made the engines virtually undrivable at low speeds, but on the NASCAR ovals, where engines spent most of their time above 5,000 RPM, they were perfect. The bottom end of these engines was also beefed up considerably compared to street engines. The connecting rods were forged steel pieces that could handle the enormous stresses of high RPM operation. The pistons were specially designed for the high compression ratios and extreme operating conditions. The crankshafts were forged and balanced to perfection. Even the cooling systems were optimized for racing. These engines generated enormous amounts of heat, so everything from the water pump to the radiator had to be up to the task. The oil systems were also upgraded with larger capacity pans and high-volume pumps to ensure adequate lubrication under racing conditions. Ford and General Motors weren't about to take this lying down. When the Hemi-powered Mopar started dominating NASCAR, it sent shockwaves through the automotive industry. Suddenly, every manufacturer was scrambling to develop their own answer to the Hemi threat. Ford's response was the 427 Single Overhead Cam Engine, or SOHC as it became known. This was Ford's attempt to out-engineer Chrysler's Hemi by using more advanced valve train technology. The SOHC featured, as the name suggests, a single overhead camshaft that operated the valves directly through rocker arms. This design allowed for even more radical cam profiles and potentially better high RPM performance than the Hemi's pushrod setup. The Ford SOHC was an impressive piece of engineering. It featured aluminum heads, which were lighter than the iron Hemi heads, and the overhead cam design allowed for precise valve timing control. Ford claimed power outputs that rivaled or even exceeded the Hemi, and they were ready to unleash it on NASCAR for the 1965 season. General Motors, meanwhile, was working on their own solutions. The 427 Mystery motor had shown promise, and GM engineers were constantly refining their big block designs to extract more power. They also had the advantage of superior aerodynamics with their Chevelle and later the Chevrolet Laguna, which could help offset some of the power disadvantage against the Hemi. But here's where things get really interesting. NASCAR found itself caught in an impossible position. The sanctioning body had always tried to maintain some level of parity between manufacturers, ensuring that races were won by the best drivers and teams, rather than simply whoever had the most advanced technology. The Hemi's dominance threatened to upset this balance entirely. The complaints started pouring in almost immediately after the 1964 Daytona 500. Ford was particularly vocal, arguing that Chrysler's Hemi was essentially a prototype racing engine that had no relationship to anything available to the general public. They had a point. These race Hemis were hand-built, extremely expensive, and completely unsuitable for street use. Chevrolet joined the chorus of complaints, pointing out that the Hemi's advantages weren't just about power, they were about a fundamentally different approach to engine design that gave Chrysler an unfair advantage. The hemispherical combustion chamber design was simply superior for racing applications, and no amount of development work on wedge head engines was going to close the gap. NASCAR found itself caught in the middle of a manufacturer war. On one hand, they wanted to encourage innovation and technological advancement. Racing had always been about pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and the Hemi represented exactly that kind of breakthrough. On the other hand, they had a responsibility to maintain competitive balance and ensure that fans were seeing exciting, close racing rather than one-sided domination. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Ford threatened to pull out of NASCAR entirely if something wasn't done about the Hemi advantage. General Motors was making similar noises. Television networks and sponsors were concerned that the lack of competitive balance would hurt viewership and attendance. Even some fans were complaining that the races had become boring because the outcome was predetermined by who had Hemis under the hood. As the 1964 season wound down and teams began preparing for 1965, NASCAR made a decision that would shock the racing world. Rather than trying to implement complex regulations to level the playing field, they took the nuclear option. They banned the Hemi entirely. The official reasoning was based on NASCAR's homologation rules. To be eligible for competition, an engine had to be available in production cars sold to the general public. Ford argued, quite correctly, that Chrysler's race Hemi bore no resemblance to any engine available in dealerships. It was a purpose-built racing engine that had never been intended for street use. NASCAR agreed with Ford's argument and announced that for the 1965 season, the 426 Hemi would be prohibited from competition unless Chrysler made it available as a production option in their street cars. This seemed like a reasonable compromise on the surface. If Chrysler wanted to race the Hemi, they just had to sell it to the public. But there was a catch. Making the race Hemi street legal would have been virtually impossible. These engines were designed for one thing: maximum power at high RPM. They had radical cam profiles that made them nearly undrivable at low speeds, compression ratios that required race fuel, and cooling systems that were optimized for track use. The idea of putting one of these engines in a family sedan and expecting it to pass emissions tests, provide reasonable fuel economy, and offer acceptable drivability was laughable. Chrysler found themselves in an impossible position. They could either abandon their Hemi program entirely or spend enormous amounts of money developing a street-legal version of the engine. Either option would effectively end their NASCAR dominance, which was exactly what Ford and GM wanted. The announcement of the Hemi ban sent shockwaves through the Mopar community. Richard Petty, who had become synonymous with Hemi power, was devastated. His entire racing program was built around the engine's superiority, and suddenly he was being told he couldn't use it anymore. Chrysler's response was swift and dramatic. If NASCAR didn't want Hemi power, then Chrysler didn't want NASCAR. The company announced that they would be withdrawing from NASCAR competition entirely for the 1965 season. Richard Petty, the sport's biggest star, would be taking his talents elsewhere. This created a public relations nightmare for NASCAR. Losing the sport's most popular driver because of a rules change was not a good look. Fans were outraged, sponsors were concerned, and television ratings were projected to suffer. The ban that was supposed to create more competitive racing had instead driven away one of the sport's biggest attractions. Ford, meanwhile, found themselves in an awkward position. They had lobbied hard for the Hemi ban, but they were also facing their own homologation issues with their SOHC engine. NASCAR applied the same logic to Ford that they had applied to Chrysler. If you want to race it, you have to sell it. The SOHC was even less suitable for street use than the Hemi, so Ford found themselves banned as well. The 1965 NASCAR season became known as the Manufacturer Wars season, with Ford and Chrysler largely absent from the top level of competition. General Motors, by default, found themselves dominating a weakened field, but it wasn't the kind of victory anyone wanted. Winning because your competitors had been banned wasn't exactly satisfying. The story doesn't end with the ban, though. Chrysler wasn't about to give up on their Hemi program, and they certainly weren't going to let Ford and GM have NASCAR to themselves forever. The company made a bold decision. They would develop a street-legal version of the Hemi that would meet NASCAR's homologation requirements. This was easier said than done. The race Hemi's radical design would have to be significantly tamed to work in a street car. The compression ratio would need to come down to around 10.25 to 1 to run on pump gas. The camshaft would need to be much milder to provide acceptable idle quality and low-end torque. The cooling system would need to work in stop-and-go traffic, not just on a racetrack. But Chrysler's engineers were up to the challenge. Working around the clock, they developed what would become known as the Street Hemi, a production version of the legendary race engine that could actually be driven on public roads. It debuted in 1966 as an option in the Plymouth Belvedere and Dodge Coronet, and it was an instant sensation. The Street Hemi was rated at 425 horsepower, which was actually quite conservative. Most dyno tests showed the engine producing closer to 450 to 475 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful production engines of the muscle car era. It featured the same basic hemispherical combustion chamber design as the race engine, but with more streetable specifications. With the Street Hemi now available in production cars, NASCAR had to allow it back into competition. Chrysler returned to NASCAR in 1966 with a vengeance, and the Hemi-powered cars immediately began winning races again. Richard Petty returned to NASCAR and continued his winning ways, eventually becoming the sport's all-time wins leader, largely thanks to Hemi power. But NASCAR wasn't done trying to control the Hemi's dominance. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the sanctioning body implemented various rules designed to limit the engine's effectiveness. Restrictor plates were introduced to limit airflow. Weight penalties were imposed on Hemi-equipped cars. Displacement limits were enacted that forced Chrysler to develop smaller versions of the engine. In 1971, NASCAR finally succeeded in eliminating the Hemi from competition by implementing rules that effectively made it uncompetitive. The era of Hemi dominance in NASCAR was over, but the engine's legend was just beginning. The Street Hemi became the crown jewel of the muscle car era. Cars like the Plymouth Cuda, Dodge Challenger RT, and Plymouth Roadrunner became legends thanks to Hemi power. The engine's distinctive sound, incredible performance, and racing pedigree made it the ultimate status symbol among performance car enthusiasts. Today, original Hemi-powered muscle cars are among the most valuable and sought-after collector cars in the world. A numbers-matching 1970 Plymouth Cuda convertible with a 426 Hemi can sell for over $1 million at auction. The engine that was once banned from NASCAR for being too powerful has become the holy grail of American muscle. The story of the 426 Hemi is ultimately a story about innovation, competition, and the unintended consequences of being too good at what you do. Chrysler set out to build the ultimate racing engine, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But that success came with a price. The engine was so dominant that it fundamentally changed the nature of NASCAR competition. The Hemi ban of 1965 was one of the most controversial decisions in NASCAR history, but it also led to one of the greatest muscle car engines ever produced. The Street Hemi that emerged from that controversy became an icon of American automotive performance, a legend that continues to inspire enthusiasts more than 50 years later. In the end, you can't keep a good engine down. the 426 Hemi may have been banned from NASCAR, but it won something even more valuable: a permanent place in automotive history as the engine that was literally too powerful for its own good. And honestly, is there any better legacy for a performance engine than being so good that they had to change the rules just to stop you? What do you think about NASCAR's decision to ban the Hemi? Was it fair competition regulation or an overreach that hurt the sport? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the legendary engines that shaped American automotive history.